This video contains Pandaemonium Raid Series spoilers up to patch 6.01 and references to MSQ trials up to that point as well. Hello and welcome to Endwalker in Review. Today we're going to be taking a critical look at the expansion's second Savage raid from patch 6.01, Pandaemonium Asphodelos, the Second Circle Savage. This video is a subjective opinion piece reviewing the fight and not a guide, so if you're not familiar with the fight or need clarification of what I'm talking about, please consider reviewing guide material on this fight from other creators or at the pfstrat.com, or feel free to comment with questions if you have any. Now, onward to mechanics. Like P2S before it, Kampeos also has a very large hitbox, this time a closed circle one with no requirement for melee DPS to execute positionals. Common mechanics like raid wides and tank busters in this fight are fairly plain, with the tank buster specifically being just a two-player stack which tanks share together and mitigate or invuln solo. In week 1 crafted gear, some of the raid wides were hitting pretty hard if I remember correctly. Sewage Deluge could be quite threatening if not enough mitigation was applied, but otherwise there wasn't anything outstandingly notable there. The arena is a plain rectangle, but the Sewage Deluge raid wide also triggers dangerous water to flood the lower level of the arena, leaving only the 4 raised squares and the grates between them safe. By designing the fight this way, in my opinion, it plays kind of like a wall boss but in the center of the arena. It's a little bit experimental then, but since the Asphodelos Savage tier doesn't have a wall boss at all, I actually appreciate this element of experimentation in the fight's design, and I can forgive it closing off the positionals and being full uptime most of the time. In that context, the larger hitbox seems to me more reasonable here, since the challenge in most of this fight's mechanics is working within a very restricted and limited space, and yet even still there were a few optimized strats for a couple of mechanics to improve uptime, as there are times when this boss will not be centered, since it's not actually a wall boss and is capable of moving. The Cataract mechanics mix-up for Savage included an alternative tell where the cast can be spoken or winged Cataract, indicating whether the head is firing forward or backward, introducing a twist over the normal mode version of the mechanic by asking players to look at both their UI for the cast bar name and into the arena to check both facing and direction and identify the safe spots. Coherence introduces the recurring wild charge concept to endwalker raids, where the front player, who should be a tank, will take the most damage in the line stack. The other tank will be occupied with a tether that needs to be brought away from the group, and so the mechanic serves as a mitigation and responsibility check for tanks while asking all players to pre-stack so that a tether can be easily grabbed, which will come up again later in the tier. Ominous Bubbling plus Shockwave brings back light party stacks, which players who did Heidelin Extreme should be familiar with by now. And lastly, the Predatory Avarice mechanic introduces the Hard Water and Mark of the Tides debuffs, which players must read to determine who will take a spread out of the party while the rest of the players stack, all while resolving these spread and stack positions in safe spots of a Cataract pattern. The very first major mechanic of the fight then is Kampeos Harma. This mechanic is very reminiscent of AlphaScape Savage's Omega M&F fight's fundamental synergy or electric slide mechanic, which I don't have footage of, so enjoy this top clip instead. For the first time in Endwalker high-end duties, players are marked with numbers over their heads and will position accordingly so that Kampeos' body charges the squares players while the head slams the triangles players. The mechanic is pretty straightforward really, but puts players to the test at getting into position in time as well as changing position when their turn occurs. Of course, players have a tendency to call any mechanic with numbers over their heads a limit cut, and following that, the optimized strats Sleepo Cut and Sausage Cut were named accordingly and emerged quickly for groups who want to squeeze some extra uptime out of the mechanic. Channeling Flow and Channeling Overflow introduces arrows underfoot that will knock back players all the way to the wall unless they're aligned with opposite direction arrows, and that collision of players is scaled based on distance, so while these only really had one solution, players still have to execute it cleanly and correctly, or it is a very real threat to the party. Since the mechanic gives everyone a spread and an arrow once in alternating sets of 4 each, 4 players must take knockbacks while the other 4 players spread, and in doing so, nearly the entirety of the safe space is used. Testing players on debuff timers again in the second fight is a good follow-up to the first Circle Savage doing so with 4-fold shackles. It is worth mentioning that during channeling overflow, the spots where arrow players stand before the knockback comes in is outside of melee range, and so there is some opportunity for confident melee and tank players to greed some GCDs until the last second by watching their debuff timer count down to the moment the knockback occurs. After the first Kampeos Harma and channeling overflow, the rest of the fight is just made of additional variations on these mechanics, like including Mark of the Tides with Cataract in half of the arena while the head dashes the other half, or the notorious Coherence at the same time as channeling overflow toward the end of the fight, which requires decisively fast movement to get into positions on time and commonly became a tank LB3 mechanic in the Party Finder. As for aesthetics, let's be honest, Hippocampus is a giant dog thing with a winged head that floats over the rest of its body and lives in Pandaemonium's sewers. Couldn't tell you what the ancients were thinking, and if the story explained it, I can't remember, but the boss is definitely a badass monster and the sewer theme enables this limited safe zone arena concept in the first place. It's alright. Sewers aren't complicated or bright and flashy, but we're fighting a big monster in a dark place. It's classic RPG stuff and that's cool with me. Like I said in the last video, Square Enix used the same song for the first 3 fights, which definitely left me feeling very tired of it, but it's not actually bad or anything, just a little low energy. It fits better with the look of the first arena than this one for sure. Well, short and sweet, but like I said earlier, I think this boss basically takes the place of a wall boss this tier, and quite frankly feels similar enough to one in gameplay most of the time, with constrained arena space as the main theme. It has a few fiddly and sensitive mechanics, especially channeling overflows and Kampeos Harma for progression, but isn't an overly difficult or memorable fight. I wouldn't say it's a dud either though. Kampeos Harma and the finally channeling overflow and coherence toward the end of the fight are definitely kind of the high points and definitely where a majority of progression time would be spent on the fight, but from what I've seen and heard, most players who cleared P2S went on to clear this one too. It's fun enough, straightforward, but it won't be the first fight that comes to mind in the future when looking back and reminiscing on raiding an endwalker. Well, that's it, so thank you for watching and please consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps these videos find an audience and keeps you up to date when I release anything new. Thank you, and see you next time for Asphodelos' somewhat controversial PF Slayer P3S.